And when we asked our guest today, Buckminster Fuller, to send in biographical information, here's what we got, folks. This is 67 pages worth of honorary degrees and credentials, accomplishments, publications. You have been called the greatest living genius. You have been called the Leonardo da Vinci of our time, the Benjamin Franklin of the space age, and you've also been called a crackpot. How would you describe yourself?
As a very average human being.
Buckminster Fuller, the man you just heard from, is an engineer, inventor, mathematician, and philosopher.
He has been called a visionary, a prophet, a genius.
Mr. Fuller, of all of the people that I have interviewed, you are the most difficult to define. You called yourself a random element. Other people have called you an experience.
An author, a designer, a scientist.
He's even a cosmogonist, which I neither know how to spell nor do I know what it is.
A New World thinker, if there ever was one, or Buckminster Fuller.
We ourselves consist physically of atoms, and we know that all the atoms have their frequencies. It is theoretically possible to pick up all of our frequencies and actually send us by radio.
You mean we'll be able to transmit ourselves somewhere else?
Yes.
To be reconstituted in some distant place?
Yeah.
I was born at an extraordinary moment. In 1895, the year I was born, the X-ray was discovered. We could then see what had previously been invisible. When I was 3, the electron was discovered. When I was 7, the first automobile drove into the city of Boston. I was brought up being told that it was inherently impossible for man to fly. When I was 8, the Wright brothers flew. By the time I was 11, Marconi's wireless was in practical use to signal SOS. When I was 14, man got to the North Pole. When I was 16, he got to the South Pole. So impossibles were happening seemingly every day. Evolution is integrating all of humanity. We are accelerating together at a tremendous pace.
Mr. Fuller?
Yes.
We had a number of topics given us, and we always let our speakers choose their own topics. Our audiences have come prepared to hear a number of things when the topics were set. So, is it man in the age of science, or...
the prospects of humanity.
The prospects of humanity in the age of science.
All right. Good.
Or the prospects of
That's
humanity.
pretty complicated.
Oh,
the
prospects of humanity. Prospects of humanity.
We live in an age of tensions.
Bucky Fuller sure could talk. In the 60s and 70s, he lectured 400 or 500 times a year, going around the world 122 times to deliver his message.
When you met him, you came believing that you were going to meet a great man, and therefore you assumed he was, even though his physical presence didn't necessarily project that.
We are honored that he speaks to us tonight on the subject, the prospects of humanity. Buckminster Fuller.
It's sort of nice in a way that the great man was not, in fact, 6.5 feet tall with a booming voice and sort of looking like John Wayne or something. I mean, he was small, New England storekeeper, almost.
You know, he talked about his lectures as thinking out loud, and he had a kind of what I thought of as a performance at the beginning of a talk, which was he would stand with his hand back of his head like this, as if somehow or another you were compressing out of his brain these ideas, and he would stand in front of the audience for an embarrassing time.
And he started to speak. Well, you know, Bucky started slowly and slowly, and then by the time he got going, he was speaking at 500 miles an hour.
People say, never mind that space stuff, let's get down to Earth. So you say, where is that? Where's that non-space? It simply assumes that there really is an infinite world that went absolutely stretched on and on. And above it, something we call up, there is something called space. Down, there's something called hell. But the words up and down relate to this flat concept of the world. The words up and down have no meaning when we're dealing in a spherical Earth. And the spherical Earth is moving, rotating, moving on through space all the time. We're all aboard of a spaceship.
The world, Bucky thought, is in a race between education and catastrophe. That if we don't learn how to solve our problems, we're doomed.
Tiny little spaceship. And a great little tiny spaceship in great trouble. Beautifully designed, beautifully supplied. We're polluting very rapidly with our practical, let's get down to Earth and let's get down to this day's profit.
This led him to a certain kind of frenzy, as if time were going to run out at 2 in the morning that night, so that he kept talking.
And our parents and society locally preoccupied in having to make a profit this year and not realizing what predicament we really are in. So we have a young world really deeply apprehensive intuitively, not really knowing practically what you ought to do about it, but feeling that all the world is asleep at the switch.
For those people who were into him, you know, we would sit there for 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours. Sometimes, you know, I was at a lecture once that went on for about 18 hours.
Man's got to dare to really say what does he know and really see what
He had this confidence that science and technology could answer everything. And the world could be made to work and function right if only we would stop our nonsense and get down to business and listen to him.
It is highly feasible. This is the real news of our century. It is highly feasible to take care of all of humanity at a higher standard of living than anybody has ever experienced or dreamt of, to do so without having anybody profit at the expense of another, so everybody can enjoy the whole earth, and can all be done by 1985.
He had a vision that for him was as clear and lucid as it could be, that there was a way to solve it. Housing, food, population explosion, pollution.
We in our day are literally going to see man become a physical success in the universe before he graduates into his larger function as universe man. Thank you.
He was a small and disappointing child, born to a fine old New England family. He was cross-eyed, unpopular, badly behaved, and bullied at school.
One of my first days at kindergarten, the teacher brought us some toothpicks and semi-dried peas and told us to make structures. With my bad sight, I was used to seeing only bulks. I had no feeling at all about structural lines. The other children who had good eyes were familiar with houses and barns. Because I couldn't see, I naturally had recourse to my other senses. When the teacher told us to make structures, I tried to make something that would work. Pushing and then pulling, I found that the triangle held its shape when nothing else did. The other children made rectangular structures that seemed to stand up because the peas held them in shape. The teacher called all the other teachers in primary school in to take a look at this triangular structure. I remember being surprised that they were surprised.
They called him Four Eyes, which was rather cruel, but he took it all in good nature. Bucky, he was one of those fellows that rode through the rough waters and was able to navigate himself. He had very high grades in science and mathematics. He had A's in all his studies. His one big trouble with the teachers was they asked too many questions. He would argue with them and dispute. They'd bring out a point and he'd dispute it. And teachers don't like that.
I remember my arithmetic. I learned my fractions very nicely, and then I learned how to manipulate the fractions. And one day the teacher said, "I'm going to teach you a better way." You wonder why she didn't give you a better way the first time. So this is called decimals. And by then we had all those fractions, so we said here's 1/8 is 0.125, and a quarter is 0.25, and a third is 0.333, goes out the window and over the hill. Some of the things stayed in the room, and other things went out the window, and you wondered whether this really is a better system or not, and you wondered whether the teacher knew what you were talking about.
He was an abrasive kid. He thought he knew better.
He was outside of the accepted traditions, outside of the accepted structures. He didn't really fit anywhere, whether in universities, whether in industrial setups, or anywhere else.
He got kicked out of Harvard. Every male Fuller since 1760 was a graduate. By 1920, he'd gone bankrupt in the building trade. At 27, his 3-year-old daughter died in his arms. A despairing Bucky Fuller began to drink heavily and thought of suicide.
He was on the shore of Lake Michigan thinking about throwing himself in, but then it came to him that he said he suddenly realized that he didn't belong to himself. He didn't have the right to do away with himself, that he had acquired certain pieces of useful information and that he was obliged to use those. And so from then on, he would devote himself not to any personal agenda, but to using this information for the benefit of mankind.
We seek in the essential pages of 4D to create a book that shall never end. We seem to be at the economic crisis of our era. We have industrialized all the non-essentials and the near-essentials. We must realize that we have overlooked the most essential product for industrial production, the home.
There's a flood of interrelated ideas that come at the end of the 1920s, and which actually sustained him for the rest of his life. It's almost as though Fuller was a person in imminent fear of death, as it were, and he wanted to leave a message telling people something. It's just ideas with airplanes, with zeppelins, with searchlights, with cranes on top of them, this kind of thing. It was like a kind of singular brainstorming. It set him apart, I think.
He proclaimed a design revolution that would focus first on housing. He spent months drawing and writing about factory-built houses, light enough to be delivered by air. He called them lightful houses, then 4D. In fact, he began to call himself 4D.
There are certain individuals who one might say were driven mad by the 20th century. You could say Picasso, Le Corbusier, Buckminster Fuller, maybe Stravinsky, certain composers. There is a kind of madness. They outrage the contemporary view, but they're driven crazy by all the forces that they see at work on the century and all the potentialities that the century has which are not exploited.
We are convinced that the progress of life, the living abodes of humans, will become more and more decentralized and industry more and more centralized. When it is possible for us to say to the service station, take up this house of mine here in Maine or Montana and give me another in Italy, Cape Town, or Manchuria with a differential of $25 for the job, we will all become universal citizens.
Bucky really thought he had the answer. He left his wife Anne and the new baby with the in-laws, packed a few things, and landed in Greenwich Village, where he thought people might listen.
He suddenly appeared at my studio in Washington Square South with a little suitcase. And he said, "Can you hook me up, Tony?" I said, "Yeah, gladly." And I had this wicker couch, very deep and comfortable. I said, "Can you sleep there?" He said, "Oh, I'd be glad to sleep there." So he slept there for the next 6 months.
He had this brilliant idea. He was going to revolutionize the whole building industry by having a house that you could simply hang up in place, pre-manufacture all the parts.
He said he would like to make a model of the Dymaxion house. I didn't know what he meant by Dymaxion house. He said, well, you see, I like to make a model. So I gave him a card table, which he put in the middle of the studio. He went to Romany Marie's in the evening, and she gave him dinner.
It was Prohibition time, so there was no liquor. But you could buy a cup of Turkish coffee and stay there all night. People would come and talk about ideas. Bucky had ideas about everything.
The uptowners, as we call them, used to come down slumming, and they come to Marie's to watch the artists, don't you know?
She took care of all these poor starving creatures. That's what they looked like. She just took care of them, and it was the kind of thing that they had down there in Greenwich Village in those days.
And he never mentioned money, never once. Because when he was with me, he didn't need any, because Romany Marie gave him dinner, and I fed him breakfast and lunch. And he didn't have to pay rent. He never talked about his wife, whom he loved dearly. He never talked about his personal life. He talked about tension and what you call a hexagon. He always was talking about the universe. He said the whole universe is in tension. And I said, yes, I know. And for the next 6 months, he worked on this model. When he finally got it finished, he presented it to the Architectural League.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a first and very crude paper model of a house designed for industrial reproduction. Its requirements must be that it should be proof against fire, flood, tornado, earthquake, electrical storms, marauders. It must be proof against drudgery, that is, in it must be accessories with which a housewife can accomplish all her house cleaning within 15 minutes.
The house would rotate with the sun, and it would cost about $5,000 when it was finished. And it could be carried on, it could be disassembled, put on a truck, and carried anywhere.
The house is delivered by a service station which makes a round hole in the ground into which goes a septic and fuel tank. On the head of this tank is planted...
Bucky started out interested in everything. He ended up applying himself to housing because he thought it was one of the artifacts of human beings that had had the least development throughout history. What he did is that he decided to reinvent it himself.
Or a dirigible mooring mast. The maximum height of the house is immediately reached by this mast, and from this point, all the balance of the structure is hung.
We have the central mast. You can see the poetry that would fit around a circular building around a mast. Perfect. Has nothing at all to do with architecture, and all to do with dreams.
At a time when all kinds of other architects were talking about expressing the idea of technology, Fuller really wanted to use technology. That's the tremendous difference.
And of course, in the 20s, his language was a trumpet that intrigued all of us. I mean, we all believed in the machine. The machine was the aesthetic of the 20s. It started, of course, by the Cubists.
The Dymaxion house was a whole new kind of house altogether. It really was a machine for living. Le Corbusier called the modern house a machine for living in, but by comparison to Fuller's house, which was the true machine for living, Le Corbusier's house was a little Cape Cod cottage with gingham curtains in the window. It was so traditional.
We are living in a spheroidal universe, around a spheroidal world, not a cubical sugar lump world, despite Mr. Euclid.
The architects were impressed with it, but they wouldn't recognize him as an architect. And they wouldn't recognize him as an engineer either. They didn't realize, they said, what are you going to do with it? Who's going to buy it? It was not for our civilization. It was impractical. Who was going to buy it for $5,000 and go off with it and set it up? Nobody was going to do that. That was a dreamer's idea, don't you know?
He wasn't with us. He was off somewhere in another dimension.
My teleologic stimulation first grew out of boyhood experiences on a small island 11 miles off the mainland in Penobscot Bay in the state of Maine. My grandmother acquired Bear Island in the hope that it would serve through many years to hold her family and descendants together by providing them with experience in coping with nature in its most primitive, sometimes stormy, often foggy, and always beautiful state. All the summers of my boyhood were spent here on the bay. Every morning I had to row 6 miles to get the mail, no matter what the weather. Most of the islands in the bay were completely uninhabited. In going around in my little boat, I got to know all the fishermen farmers. They were tremendously ingenious in making their own tools and boats and combining the arts of the sea and the land. Everything I can remember begins here.
Well, it was certainly low-tech. He wanted it that way, and he, as well as the rest of the family, they refused for years to have electric lights. That they didn't want a generator there because the noise of it would disturb the quietness of the island. But for Bucky, it was the origin of all of the ideas that he developed, which were largely ideas about technology and his early experience with fooling around in small sailboats, which led him to think increasingly about the use of materials in tension rather than in compression. All kinds of thoughts of that kind, he always said, they originated during those summers when he was in a low-tech situation.
Now, I'm going to give you an important kind of a picture. I hear a lot of people say, I don't like machinery and technology, it's making a lot of trouble, upset all the old things. So we're going to take all the machinery away from all the countries in the world, all machinery, all the tracks and the wires and the works, we're going to dump it all in the ocean. And you'll discover that within 6 months, 2 billion people will die of starvation, having gone through great pain away. So you say, that's not a very good idea, let's put the machinery back where it was. Then, we're going to take all the politicians from all the countries around the world, and we're going to send them a trip around the sun. And you find we keep right on eating. And with the political barriers down, you'll have what the scientists have said is necessary. The scientists say very clear, you could make the world work and take care of 100% of humanity at higher standard living than anybody's ever known, despite an increasing population, but you can't do it with the barriers any more than you can try to run the human organism with a wall between the ear and the eye and the stomach. It is an organic whole. It is a total industrialization.
Perhaps the first time that I saw him playing around with something that nobody else was playing around with was when he was working on the Dymaxion car.
In 1933, in the middle of the Depression, Bucky left Ann to go to Connecticut with his pockets full of investors' money. He believed his idea for a car could turn the economy around.
Just as Fuller's expectations from the Dymaxion horse were extraordinarily ambitious in what he wanted it to perform, far beyond the technology available at the time, so were his expectations of the car. He had this idea of a car drawn in the early Urgent sketches. He wanted it to be a combination aircraft and car. He wanted to be able to fly to any part of the world. He wanted to be able to land anywhere. He wanted it to be able to work on water as well.
And so he decided he would invent a transportation device that would fly or drive as required. And he called it the omnidirectional plummeting device.
He started with these very ambitious ideas of what a car could do, and very rapidly had to retract them. And the idea of it flying, of course, is one of the first things that had to go.
Cars in 1932 looked like a Model A Ford, and they were very inefficient and noisy and not the faintest hint of streamlining. And Bucky actually went so far as to hire an aerodynamicist, and they really went to town and designed the car to get good mileage. He rethought the whole thing, the suspension, the front-wheel drive for stability, and it used a Ford V8 engine, a flathead V8 engine from the 33 Ford. In a Ford, on a good day, it got at 16, 17 miles a gallon. And his car, which was 21 feet long and would seat 11 people, it got 30 miles a gallon at cruising hard.
It only had 3 wheels.
Okay, he chose to put it on 3 wheels because that's all the wheels anybody needs to stand up, just like a stool only needs 3 legs.
But it felt exactly safe because it didn't wiggle. It went straight on, just like any other car.
Bridgeport Post, July 1933. 3,000 spectators, including many prominent men in the speedboat and aviation world, witnessed the first test of a 3-wheeled car. The Dymaxion, built on the streamlining principles of fast boats, shot along in its first trial with Buckminster Fuller, its inventor, at the wheel.
The Dymaxion car was utterly radical in 1933.
I mean, there's no way you could think of this in terms of any other car.
It was radical in its day, and it was so utterly radical visually that he was actually enjoined by the New York Police Department to not drive it in Midtown Manhattan because it literally stopped traffic. He pulled up to Madison Square Garden in the thing once, and it caused a traffic jam that took 7 hours to untangle.
Here's the Bullitt Auto with only 3 wheels. Watch your step. "19 feet long, but look at it do ring around a Rosie with this cop. Great stuff if he tries to hand out a ticket. Get him busy and say goodbye."
And the thing I really do remember is that it could turn on a dime. And I've never seen a car that could turn that way, just right straight around.
Bucky saved in his files the tickets that he got driving the car, and he was caught. They timed him between towns at like 110 miles an hour. It's unheard of speeds, especially when he was showing off for celebrity friends like Amelia Earhart. And he kept the speeding tickets proudly in his files. Some of them were pretty outrageous. It's a wonder he didn't go to jail.
And of course, everybody stared at it. And if he parked anybody, there would be a crowd around it. It was an amazing machine, really.
Bucky's amazing machine created a sensation at the Chicago World's Fair, and so did Bucky Fuller himself.
My first glimpse of Fuller was in the 30s, and he was a very glamorous figure, and he loved to party. He thought he was a great womanizer. He was very attractive to women, and he was charming to them, and they loved to talk to them. But as a romantic figure, I suspect he was more of a mascot than a Romeo.
Bucky, I didn't know he was married for a long time. Then I discovered he was married, and then I discovered that Anne stayed in Long Island in the Hewlett household in Hewlett, Long Island.
They had apparently no problem in being apart a great deal.
Bucky told me that Anne liked staying out in the country, and she was not interested in sex, and she urged him to go out and do what he had to do, but to let her be Mrs. Fuller.
He would say that he didn't think she understood what he was trying to do, but then I've been in meetings where Bucky would speak to people directly for 2 or 3 hours about what he was trying to do, and they didn't understand either.
He liked to dazzle people, and why not women, you know? He was a little bit of a con man in that way. He had the gift of charisma, and he used it.
Bucky and his car dazzled everyone from Walter Chrysler to Henry Ford. Would-be investors traveled all the way from Europe on the Graf Zeppelin to the Chicago World's Fair to test drive the car and talk about production. For a moment, Bucky was riding high. The investors landed and took their first ride in the Dymaxion car.
They're traveling in this car. The steering wheel moves outside the track with the front 2 wheels at speed. Another vehicle comes in between, and the car rolls over. Someone dies. The 2 backers decide that they will have nothing further to do with the project.
No one really knows what caused the crash, but Bucky was relieved when the coroner's investigation cleared the Dymaxion car.
Financially, the vehicle was a disaster. The company was a disaster. It was put into receivership, and all the parts and tools and all the equipment were sold at a sheriff's sale in 1934.
If it had been produced in quantity, cars today would be very drastically different than what they are. His 1933 car would still be considered extremely high performance and ecologically acceptable even by today's standards.
And I do remember thinking at the time, this is the car of the future. This is the way cars are going to be, and won't it be wonderful and terrific? And I never saw the Dymaxion car again.
Every time we make experiments, you always learn more, you can't learn less. It's very extraordinary. The metaphysical, the know-how always increases. Exactly the opposite of what all the books are appreciating it all the time. We're trying to work back to mortgage to debt. It's a failure. Somebody say to you, anything man needs to do, he knows how to do, he can afford to do, and he better start doing it. Thank you.
You only meet somebody like Bucky once in your life.
He was kind of pixelated, really.
He often wanted to do things in a certain way that didn't make much sense.
At one time, he was so pleased that he had worked out that if you were traveling, it made more sense to buy a shirt when you arrived and wear it there, and then give it to your porter or the chambermaid instead of a tip.
I worked on a profile for the New Yorker magazine of Bucky in '65. The checking department got hold of it about 3 weeks before it was supposed to run. And by that time, Bucky was off. I think he was in New Zealand at the time. And they reached him by telephone. And the checking department at the New Yorker is quite accustomed to spending a long time checking facts. But I think this was unprecedented in their experience, because they were on the phone to New Zealand with Bucky for something like 17 hours. Because he wanted to go over every single fact.
Bucky.
In the summer of 1940, my friend, the writer Chris Morley, and I were driving through Missouri, Hannibal, Missouri, where Mark Twain lived, to see the fence Tom Sawyer whitewashed. I noticed in the wheat fields a row of glistening, galvanized, corrugated steel grain bins, and I was struck by the ease with which they could be converted into quite livable fireproof huts. Nobody had thought of them as houses before. I told Chris that there was a most effective engineering unit for a small prefabricated house. That grain bin would provide enough room to house a small family at a cost of less than $1 per square foot of floor space with fireproof construction. And that's 80% below construction costs in the building industry. Those bins could easily be converted into dwelling machines. Soon after, Chris's novel, Kitty Foyle, was a great success. So he put up the money, and something no money can buy, a backing of creative enthusiasm, a confidence and joy in individual initiative.
The difference between Bucky Fuller and other people is that he would think about something and then get out of his chair and think it was something he had to do something about.
Let's all meet at my house. Just make yourselves at home.
The Dymaxion deployment unit was the successor to the Dymaxion house.
If someone will play the cone.
Fuller was always concerned with the distribution of houses, that they should be a service industry.
In case someone feels
and he understood that you could simply take this Butler grain bin and turn it into a dwelling.
At my house, let my house be your house too.
It was in a sense part of the New Deal. It was part of a project for reactivating agricultural life in the American Midwest in the Depression. But because of World War II, the orders for the grain bins went to the military, and it was in effect never used for its intended purpose of providing housing.
Let's all get together and maybe lift a few. Let's all meet at my house. Let my house be your house too.
One of the things I do is never to try to persuade anybody to. You don't try to sell anything. You see what needs to be done and you do it. And you wait till a man says, "What is that?" And then you tell him what it is. And then he said, for instance, there's no use in going around with pull motors door to door, like full of bushmen. So I like to sell pull motors. People say, "We don't need a pull motor here." But all of a sudden, there's suffocation, and you got to have a pull motor in a hurry, and it's lucky you did it. So I find that society has its emergencies by what they call emergence by emergency.
The march of time.
The Second World War was about as big an emergency as you could have. When the war ended, Bucky wasn't the only one talking about housing.
The most urgent peacetime problem is finding a place to live. For today, the United States is in the midst of the most acute housing shortage of its history. With apartment vacancies
Bucky Fuller had this dream about a home, and he wanted to build it. And he couldn't find any builders that was interested in it because it was a revolutionary idea.
Building is hampered by shockingly inefficient practices. For much of the construction industry still clings to handwork in a machine
Bucky
age.
called the construction industry the craft and graft industry. And he regarded it as an 18th century craft skill that was inappropriate in an industrial society. And considering there's a finite amount of material on the earth, he thought the only way we were going to have social justice and house everybody at a good standard was to use the materials absolutely as efficiently as possible, which meant aircraft technology.
Aviation technology, which at midpoint in the century, in 1945, was the most advanced technology that existed, which delivered, in Fuller's terms, the maximum performance for the minimum weight, which is what he always was after.
When World War II was over, there were going to be thousands of aircraft workers, highly skilled aircraft workers with all this amazing machinery, with nothing to do, and they'd all be fired. So he thought he'd put that two together. He would make houses in an airplane factory.
So he went to Harvey Brown, international president of the Machinists Union, said, "Do you have any locations that would be interested in this kind of a project?" And without hesitation, Harvey Brown said, "Wichita, Kansas, Beech Aircraft." So Mr. Fuller came to Wichita.
I'd read about the man before he showed up in our area, you know, and it looked like we was going to see something new in housing.
The most striking development is a revolutionary low-priced home designed by Buckminster Fuller for mass production. With their present potential, the nation's aircraft plants could turn these out at the rate of $2 million a year.
Well, Mr. Fuller, why a round house?
Why not? The only reason houses have been rectangular all these years is that is all we could do with the materials we had. Now, with modern materials and technology, we can apply to houses the same efficiency of engineering that we apply to suspension bridges and airplanes. The ventilator on top can induce a complete air change.
Investors gave Bucky enough money to build just one prototype, but it looked like he was about to pioneer a whole new industry.
Fortune magazine, April 1946. This dwelling machine is likely to produce greater social consequences than the introduction of the automobile. Fuller's house has a better than even chance of revolutionizing the building industry.
The publicity for the Wichita House is very extensive. In the period up until the end of World War II, they received 37,000 orders for Wichita houses.
August 20th, 1946. Dear Sir, my congratulations to you for being the first person to design and build a home that is different. I am completely sold on your house. If humanly possible, I'm going to be the first in my vicinity to have your house as my home.
Getting to the point, is it possible for me to obtain one of these homes? My family consists of my wife and me. We want a small, modern home
looking for a place to live for my family. And my wife and I both agree in preferring your manufactured house to the plastic and prefabricated
story on you and your modern home in the latest edition of Reader's Digest, and then seeing you in your home on the screen of our town theater, I can't seem to get that modern igloo out of my mind. I am very sure, sir, that your home and your ideas will be a great success. If and when you do build out here and we could move in, I assure you, sir, that my wife then and I will do our very best to help put it over for you. Hoping to hear from you soon. I remain R.L. Casey, 218 North Sycamore Street, South Bend, Indiana.
At Wichita, Kansas, in the very center of the United States, the housing problem brings out a circular dwelling built of aluminum and plastics. Instead of a foundation, this cornerless cottage is suspended from a central mast of stainless steel. The engineering principle, with the safety factor of a suspension bridge, permits new ideas like a revolving roof, which gives a complete...
This was intended to be tried and tested, and the stockholders, unfortunately, said, start making them. You don't need any more trials. And there's an old adage that says sooner or later you have to shoot the engineer or nothing ever gets built.
Bucky didn't want to go, but everyone else said, let's go. He still had changes he wanted to make.
The clothes closet appears with a flick of the finger. And a built-in dust-proof hat rack. But most interesting of all is the conveyor belt linen closet. Recessed in the wall, the press of a button rotates the conveyor shell. A roundhouse may seem strange, but in a housing shortage, people are giving attention to all new ideas.
And he had 35,000 people send in checks and said, I want one of these things. And Fuller just kept saying, we got to build one more round of prototypes.
They said to him, Bucky, we've got to build this. Forget the changes. If we make another model, we'll put the changes in.
And once he learned he wasn't going to have the price of further financing was for him to surrender any control of manufacturing standards or design principles. He, in effect, pulled the rug out from under himself and took his toys and went home because he didn't want to accept the further capitalism required under those conditions.
And it finally came down to a really nasty internecine fight, and he stood his ground, and the company went bankrupt.
As for the one and only Wichita House, one of the investors bought it and reassembled it across town. The Graham family would live there for the next 20-odd years.
It looked like something out of outer space. Usually my friends came out on Sunday. That was our big tour day.
We had visitors all the time, and we had visitors, some very famous visitors like Dale Carnegie and the guy who founded Dairy Queen.
What he wanted to do with the Wichita House was to create, again, his air deliverable, his universally distributable dwelling, and remove the element of scarcity. His solution to the problems of the world, for the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-not, was production. It was production so that everybody could have.
But housing hasn't changed since the day we built that house to now. Really, materials are getting worse because we're running out of good lumber. Other than that, there's not much change in house construction. But that one, it just was something I could have purchased as a worker, see? That's what I saw in it. So that's a house that I could own one day.
You're going to have to find out what needs to be done. And that is the design responsibility. So when you hear everybody out here talking about ecology and so on, it's because the architects are not doing anything. If you could sit around and draw some pictures, I ought to feel, if I get pretty, that's enough. You don't ever have to worry about beauty or pretty, because if you really understand your problem, if you solve it correctly, so life really goes on. This is regeneration of life, and you do it the most economically, so economically it is realizable. It always comes out beautiful. That's why a rose is beautiful. It is just one of those parts of the great regenerative process where there is an a priori design of the universe that had the universe working. If you want to be in part of that, you can't miss beauty. That part, your joy will be there. Your joy will be just as much as it is with a beautiful sunset.
After the Wichita House, which was a catastrophe in Fuller's life, he retired really to consider his position.
He'd had this
real decline in fortune in the world. His car had crashed, he was broke, he was evicted. He was really down on his luck, and he had no place. No academic institution would accept him.
In 1948, Black Mountain College was looking for an architect to teach in its summer program. They couldn't find one, so they hired Bucky Fuller.
Dear Mr. Fuller, if I do not hear from you to the contrary, I will be at the train in Black Mountain around 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday the 12th. I look forward very much to seeing you. Sincerely yours, Joseph Albers, Dean.
So there was this marvelous place with no real curriculum, no real classes, no grades, no accreditation, nothing much else except a place where people tended to congregate, people who were somewhat on the periphery of the society, artists for the most part. It was a community that survived or barely survived on what we had to eat and some of what we could raise and the very little money that came in from the GI Bill. Bucky came down with a real intention, apparently, of trying to build this basic geodesic dome. Geodesic meaning to cover the earth.
He had been there 1 or 2 days, and he, that evening, was to give a talk, which lasted for a number of hours. And on the table, as he was talking, were these models of the various geometric shapes that interested him, with which he worked.
His head was like a globe, and his eyes were very sparkling, so that there was a kind of dynamism that came from him.
And of course, we all fell in love with him. I don't know how else to describe it. For me, it was Bucky Fuller and his magic show. He was like the Wizard of Oz, really, with all the gadgets working.
I remember Bucky and a group of students walking over toward the shore of the lake, carrying these strips of white Venetian blind metal material, and they were bolting it together. And I wasn't paying much attention to it, because that was not untypical for Black Mountain. Any such activity could be going on at any time.
They were watchers, having the blinds cut and getting them stapled together, and there were more and more people clustered around every day until it was said, tomorrow is the day.
I can't remember it in detail, except suddenly this thing began to appear.
And it immediately collapsed.
It went up, and then it collapsed. And you went, oh, you know that. And Fuller just stood there, just looking with amazement. And then everyone got together and began to talk about it.
I remember Bucky saying he never expected it to be able to stand, but what he wanted to see was structurally how much integrity he could develop in that.
And instead of being unhappy, he was delighted. He said, I only learn when I have failures, that he welcomed failure, because that way he was led to his discoveries.
We went to the nearby airport because he wanted to see it from the air. And so I've got photographs of all of that. And it's so beautiful. There's this long white studies building in these mountains, and then you see this, it looks like a fallen star, It's just beautiful.
Sometimes the goals would seem beyond the realm of the possible. At that point, the geodesic dome seemed beyond the realm of the possible. But there was a larger purpose to Bucky always, and a larger humanitarian and sociological purpose. I remember a conversation with him, sitting around in the dining room one day, and he said his view was that he thought it was perfectly conceivable that he would be able to provide housing for all the people of the world with this basic geodesic dome, which could be stacked in airplanes and then dropped from the airplanes down into India and Pakistan and the devastated portions of Europe as places where people would be able to at least have a habitat. And, you know, at the same time that one was listening to this and it was intriguing and captivating, there was also a little sense of, he's a little wacko, you know, because it can't, first of all, he hasn't gotten the dome to stand up yet. Well, that of course was only a matter of time, a very short time.
Well, the following year, Fuller returned. Again, there was the excitement about building the dome again to see if it's possible. And it was built, and it stayed. It stayed in position. The nice thing that happened was that evening when Fuller entered the dining room, and most everyone was ready to eat, and he came in, and everyone stood up and applauded him. Of course, he just bounces in, you know. And he was so excited. He was so excited.
One had the sense that this man, right from the beginning, had some totally different way of looking at the world, which made, given the state of the world even then, made real sense to one.
This is a world now reeling after the Second World War, reeling and trying to recover. And here was a man who said, I believe I know how to house the people. I believe I know how we can better utilize our foodstuffs and material. And it was such a large, compassionate view of the world that it took one's breath away. And I think that that was the turn in his life. That was not untypical of Black Mountain, that it was a real, could be an epiphany for somebody that could start you on the rest of your life. And an awful lot of people, I think, had that experience. Bucky certainly did.
One time, Bucky was telling about his experience in making a new discovery. And he described it metaphorically. He said, you know, when you come to something that no one else has ever encountered, it has a musty smell, as if it hadn't been opened since the world began.
He said early on, never design anything you can already build. Always work in the not quite attainable. Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
I always have the feeling that Bucky's appearance on this earth was meant to open the window to one thing. It was the dome. It was the dome.
So Bucky became a kind of Johnny Appleseed for his dome idea. There probably wasn't a campus in this country that didn't see Bucky Fuller in the 1950s.
St. Louis Post-Dispatch, March 28, 1952. A dome-shaped structure of strange appearance is attracting a lot of attention and arousing a great deal of curiosity on the Washington University campus. What the heck is it? Startled passersby ask.
Oh, we found that our cube has no structural integrity whatsoever. But this is not lost its shape. It's our friend the tetrahedron.
Most of the universe builds with post and little construction, which is essentially something on top of something that doesn't want to be there.
He said, look around you in nature. You don't see any right angles. You see angles and triangles and surfaces and spheres.
And, you know, nothing is like this. Everything is either circular or triangular.
I could make a sphere. I could go in any direction, except I couldn't get away from the universe finally.
It doesn't exist in nature, the kind of things that we build with.
There's the rest of the universe and me.
Opinion about Fuller varies from adulation to raised eyebrows, but nobody has ever denied that he is a veritable idea factory.
So 3 times 4 is 12, and then there's an upside-down tetrahedron.
He talked hours a day for a week to the Washington University students. He talked about philosophy and morality, which at first seemed to some an odd way to start building a dome. And then he related everything to everything and got into geometry, and pretty soon they had grasped the idea.
It was an incredible
incredibly economical way to enclose space with minimum surface and with minimum structure to create maximum strength.
Then we observe how it becomes a sphere again by itself. If it spins, it becomes a vector equilibrium. Notice that you saw the equator was moving around. She opens up. Here we have our Vice Chancellor of Washington University, who I would like, if you don't mind, sir, to just give you your thoughts about this.
Well, Mr. Fuller, this has been a thrill for Washington University, for the administration and the faculty and students. It's quite an adventure, and it's the sort of thing that we don't have the kind of an opportunity like this very often.
If you would come up, sir, and let me say thank you.
I think it's a mistake to believe that this gentle, kind, pleasant little man, which indeed he was in many ways, was in fact a shrinking violet. He had a massive ego. It was as strong and as hard as a rock.
He wanted to be praised, and I have to say flattered. This was one of the most disturbing things about him. And I've always regretted that I fell in with it. And I think most people did, and I admire those who didn't.
In that way, he was a little like Frank Lloyd Wright. You had to be with him or against him. There was no middle ground.
Sometimes one felt the reason he had to do that was because he wasn't even sure he existed. That his lack of self-confidence was so great, he kept himself listed in telephone books in cities he hadn't lived in for years, and it really mattered to him that he could go to that city and open the telephone book and see Buckminster Fuller is still there.
And out of the mechanical competence initiated in the power-borne airship comes the birth of our ability to convert our resources to serve not 30% of the population, but the whole of humanity. This is a geodesic dome designed for the United States Marine Corps. They're now in mass production and could be produced for $1,800.
The dome was such a hit that Bucky started his own company. He called it Geodesics, Inc. He found his first customers at the Pentagon.
The Marine Corps domes do, of course, relate directly back to the late 1920s projects. The idea of a product which is mass-produced and which can be located anywhere. He saw all these technical solutions as fitting into a humanity-saving master plan. The student audiences who flocked to his lectures in the 1960s and the 1970s very often opposed his involvement with the military, with the Marine Corps, with the Navy, and so on. But Fuller saw them in a much more pragmatic way. He saw that the military connection was incidental to the achievement of its service industry for housing and for shelter.
So on August 4th, 1953, Bucky Fuller finally got his flying house after all.
Is somebody in here tell me what this building weighs? Can anybody tell me within 100 million tons? And you don't think about what buildings weigh. And engineers do have to know in order to get them to stand up. It's not in the language of society. That's all I'm trying to get out. And if you don't know what your buildings weigh, you obviously don't know what kind of performance you're getting out of what you're investing. I just want to really rub it in that this was a very powerful area of potential gain.
Bucky Fuller was a great man for weight. He always worried about whether... He thought it was a sin, almost. Yeah, in the New England sense. It was a sin to build a heavy house when you could build a light one.
The reason architects don't know how much their buildings weigh is that they think weight is good, and the more the better. You pile it on.
Look at the weight of these two bricks just compression, heavy. Here's a lovely airplane piece. Pick it up with me. Just press it. Your fingers. Light. Nothing. No.
Bucky had the idea that a house should have, there was no excuse that a house should weigh any more than or cost any more than a Cadillac.
USS Leyte weighs 40,000 tons. What does the Empire State Building weigh? What does your own home weigh?
The rest of us never paid any attention. In fact, the pyramids are quite heavy. Doesn't make them ugly. But the ugly, beautiful dichotomy didn't have any interest to him. Light, heavy. To us, merely a strange aberration.
When I built my first large geodesic dome for the Ford Motor Company in 1951. I wanted, it had to go on that Rotunda building, which was so lately built as a World's Fair building, that it couldn't take a conventional radial arch dome, and the engineers had said it couldn't be done. But young Henry Ford had heard.
Fortune magazine. Guided by colored tape stuck to prefabricated members, workmen made 19,680 spars into triangles. Triangles into octahedrons, octahedrons into trusses, and trusses into geodesic domes in 30 working days.
Architectural Forum. One of the things to come has come. This design represents the highest practical point so far attained in the skeletal enclosure of space. The dome pattern, simply built, is the product of some very sophisticated geometry.
From 1950, and the patent application which was granted in 1954, Fuller had really his first and only total financial and business success.
The fact that it seems so much lighter in construction than traditional domes, is that true?
It is around 1% of the weight of the lightest conventional radial arch.
Diamond-shaped aluminum panels, geometrically arranged and bolted together, formed the rigid shell of the new Honolulu Dome Auditorium. It took 38 men only 22 hours to put it up, and just an hour later, a crowd of nearly 2,000 people enjoyed a concert by the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra.
Associated Press. Spry and grinning, Premier Nikita Khrushchev paid a surprise inspection visit Monday to the site of this summer's American Exposition. The geodesic dome drew his most enthusiastic attention. The Americans have many interesting technical inventions, he said.
We're going to be able to convert the resources to such advantage for man that it is going to be quite possible for all men to survive with a ever-improving...
Radar warning stations at the top of the world will soon be protected by huge glass mat reinforced polyester structures known as geodesic domes. Invented by R. Buckminster Fuller, this
The
type of
dome,
structure...
along with the tower and a basic construction form, is on view in the Museum of Modern Art's garden in an exhibit that will continue until
The
next
New York
spring.
Times. Mr. Fuller's space frame and enclosures represent the greatest advance in building since the invention of the arch.
What I propose to you that really is going on is that every man is increasing his range and frequency of coming and going. We're coming to a condition where the whole world is anybody's backyard. You don't go out, you're not going out of this world, it's just in your world.
Want to house a gang at summer camp? Put a whole garden in a greenhouse? Enclose a swimming pool? Try an inexpensive geodesic dome of translucent
FAO
plastic
Schwartz,
and carefully...
Play dome with cover, $98.50. Its shape and design alone is enough to attract
A
active
play dome
youngsters.
is weatherproof, foolproof, and perhaps best of all, proof that Dad can build anything.
Whirlpool Dome. This typical plywood dome with 6 dry cleaners, furnishings...
A revolution against the straight up and down school, against the confines of hammer and nail.
Oh, MacDonald never had it so good. Canada has a new geodesic cow barn.
The Plydome Church, first of its kind, measures 39 feet in diameter, stands 19.5 feet tall, and weighs
The first high school in the United States to have as part of its structure
A new
geodesic
enterprise to design and build multi-purpose auditorium theaters with aluminum
A world-famed engineer who has dedicated his career to doing more with less, teamed up here with 2 basketball-playing porpoises to sponsor the world's first sunshade geodesic dome.
The Brooklyn Dodgers may soon have a domed stadium. As Dodgers president Walter O'Malley sees it, this dome could be the answer to rained-out ball games, and it might just keep the Dodgers in Brooklyn.
But I'm not a dome salesman. I'm an explorer in structures. I'm interested in the fundamental principles by which nature holds her shapes together.
It is doubtful whether any single architectural concept in modern times has attracted as much worldwide interest as has the geodesic dome.
Dr. Fuller, visiting American architect, introduced to Japanese architects and engineers his new domed stadium at the Nippon Television Network studio today.
Inventor R. Buckminster Fuller proposed a dome over Midtown Manhattan as a solution to New York City's pollution and weather problems at a press conference today. Dr. Fuller said the almost invisible plastic shell would virtually disappear.
Today, there are almost 2,000 geodesic domes in 40 countries around the Earth.
There are countless architects, like myself, who believe that within the general framework of Mr. Fuller's theories lie the salvation of mankind.
And if I could get a triangular grid of great circles being lines formed of spheres by a plane going through the center.
You have been watching A Visit with Buckminster Fuller.
In 1960, Bucky settled down to teach in Carbondale, Illinois, and built himself one of those dome houses. It took just 7 hours to put up.
There once was a square with a romantic flair, pure Beaux-Arts, chimneys and white. In the mood that ensued, he went factory nude, me Scropy, Corbusier, and Wright. Rome, home to a dome, on the crest of a neighboring hill, where the chores are all done before they're begun, and eclectic nonsense is nil. Rome, home to a dome.
It was the first time Bucky and Ann owned a home. They lived in their dome home for the next 12 years.
No payments to go, where you dream, dwell, and live your own time.
Dr. Buckminster Fuller, as President of the Royal Institute of British Architects, I have the great pleasure and honor to present to you the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture from 1968.
As Bucky Fuller, an architect, people keep asking that very silly question. And I don't think even he would have said he was an architect. He would have said that that's not the point.
He didn't particularly care about architecture as art, but through technology, he produced structures and buildings that had a tremendous artistic value as well as an important engineering value.
In the sense he didn't know anything at all about space, about details, about how you feel, about how you sat, how you walked, how you looked at a building. But he knew everything. He didn't need architects at all. He was the great enemy of the architectural profession throughout his life, and we loved him in spite of it.
Montreal. To the whole world, Canada says, come to the fair.
Probably one of the most exciting things in Bucky's life was being selected to build the U.S. Pavilion in the 1967 World's Fair. It was released approximately the time of Bucky and Ann's 50th wedding anniversary. It was something that he felt very strongly vindicated his years of struggle, his years of doing things not quite the way his family and others would have told him to do it.
United States Pavilion has a dome. They call it the Skybreak Bubble. It's glass and plastic covered, forces light in, forces bad weather out. On National Day, 3,000 people pass through this section.
It's 250 feet in diameter and was, at the time, the largest clear standing structure in the world.
The Grit Fair was an amazing thing, and we're picking a guru instead of an architect. The wise, ignorant government of the United States did a wonderful job of picking a sphere, a technological marvel, we all thought anyhow, and belief is the important part here. The fact that anybody could make a dome like that never crossed anyone's mind, and it's not important. What's important is that Bucky had the dream that the only way you could make a dome was his geodesic way.
To, in the sense that I would call an effective controlled environment.
Do you think that the creation of an environment like this will really help groups of people in what you've called living rig? Will it help them to want to create things like the end of wars and the end of poverty, the end of disease?
The wars have always been because there's not enough to go around. So that I don't expect these domes to be psychological persuaders and make people behave a little better. But by doing more with less, we might, instead of being able to take care of only 40% of humanity, we might be able to take care of the 100% of humanity. If we can take care of the 100% of humanity, then the fundamentals of why you have war, which is because there's not enough, seemingly has to be you and me who's going to be able to survive, then that goes automatically. So that my way of solving the problem of how do we have peace is to ensure that they have enough to go around, which means then upping the performance per pound of the resources, and that's just what this environment control does.
The dome was a very compelling image. It's a kind of triumphant symbol of American ingenuity, American mastery of technology, and the American love of enclosing great space.
Spheres are perfect, and they're big, and they make a marvelous image down the way a bit, and it dominated the fair in a very successful way. And the sphere, you could almost see it roll ahead. It was wonderful to look at it bubble.
The dome at Montreal was the only structure at that exposition which lifted people's hearts, not just their minds, because he thought he was appealing to people's minds, but it was the emotional content of that dome.
The geodesic dome, like all of Fuller's stuff, had a wonderful way of appearing to just push out everything that had come before it and make everything else look old-fashioned and boring, and this looked new and energetic. Everything else seemed tired, this seemed fresh. I mean, if you think of a world of dinky little suburban tract houses, well, if you wanted to overthrow that world, what better way than a Fuller dome in certain ways? It symbolized a whole new kind of problem solving, a whole new kind of design.
We call upon all Earth people to join with us in celebration of each other. And all you need is yourself.
Take care of our body is through a design revolution, doing more with less.
Fuller once described himself as an immigrant in the world of the young, and that's, although he knew he was no longer young, that's what he felt most at home, because he felt people had not yet built up the prejudices that would not make his arguments unsympathetic to them.
Much is really breaking up today that old people can't understand why it's breaking up. It's simply because inexorable. Change is inexorable. I know we have the option to make a success. I see that we have conditional reflexes which are
The United States lost the capability to really make war again. The United States could not mobilize the young people today again ever go into war. The young world decided we
This is today, Thursday, March 6, 1969. Here's the top news story this morning. Saigon has been hit by another rocket attack. We'll have details from Frank Blair, and he'll have other stories for us in just a few moments. I'm Hugh Downs. This is Barbara Walters, and we are going to talk in this first half hour to a very unusual man, one of the most inventive minds of our generation, Dr. R. Buckminster Fuller. He's famous for a number of things, but he's going to unveil the latest of his projects, which is called the World Game, and it, I'm told, it has the opposite intent of the familiar war game concept.
We have here, when we began to want to play world game, we were interested in how we can use the world's resources so effectively as to be able to take care of everybody at a higher standard of living than anybody's ever realized, without anybody profiting at the expense of anybody else, and without anybody impeding anybody else, so that anyone can enjoy the whole earth without interfering with the other.
I organized a group of 30 students, and we actually did the research and put together a map and a whole research project to verify some of the patterns that Bucky was often talking about.
Whereas in the United States we feed about 1 per acre. What we found in our research is that the materials of the earth are there. Now, one of the things that the people who were doing most research on food found out was that there is enough land. If we work the land in the same way...
Probably it was not a possible idea. Probably isn't possible now, even. But the thing that was brilliant about it was the idea of creating a dynamic map of the world's resources that you could see and watch and see what the interplay of forces were. It was also the tone of the times, at least for certain people.
That any man can enjoy the whole earth without any
people were trying to felt that really things were possible, that it was no longer, it wasn't the old guard, it was a new world, and that what it really took was young people initiating activity.
Those are the challenges as far as I see it. And you first have to at least find out what you got, find out what a spaceship is, because we are on this great spaceship, and it's something we just don't really tend to recognize we are. Whether you like it or not, they're all astronauts.
Absolutely, in listening to Bucky for any length of time, you would get swept up in this enormously confident, enthusiastic, idealistic vision of his that was partly the age itself. Young people had an enormously optimistic idea of what was possible for them, and he played to that with consummate skill because he really believed it.
He was singing a song, And he's singing a song about a world that was a lot of it happening inside of his head, some of it happening outside in the world, and incredibly intuitive to patterns that were way, way down the road.
And today's guest is somebody very special, and tell me a little bit about him. I've always wanted to meet him ever since I read about him in college. Buckminster Fuller.
That's right, and I felt the same way too. I'd always wanted to interview him. He's an old man now, and you realize that he's been around for just years and years and years, and has this incredible perspective, and has given us some really great insights into, the planet Earth.
Is he easy to understand?
He's a little difficult.
I think of him, of course, for the geodesic dome. That's what we all learned about, the funny little domes he wanted us to live in. Is he still promoting that concept?
The last phase of his life, which entailed lecturing all around the world continually, followed, I think, from his realization that the world was not going to go geodesic, that these things were not going to be mass-produced and recognized as meeting a universal need. So he shifted his attention to preaching the gospel of design.
By the way, people always ask me, you think people like to live in domes? That's all you ever done. You live right around it.
Bucky had an extraordinary energy, which I don't think I have.
Whatever I am, I'm not the physical. At my age, 88, I literally consumed over 300 tons of food, air, and water. All of which I converted into hair and skin and flesh and bone. All of which almost all of which I've gotten rid of also. And these parts that I got rid of joined up with other systems. So I'm convinced that whatever I am, I'm not the physical me.
I mean, he was still in his adolescent rebellion phase, from my point of view, in his 80s, He was still needing to overturn things and invent.
I know we have the option. I know we have the capability to destroy ourselves. I also know enough human beings to really be weighted on the side. I think it's touch and go, but I think we're going to make it. But don't let up. Don't let up, or we won't make it. Keep at your integrity more than ever in all your life before. So thank you, darling people. Enormous, great big ball coming around here. We're revolving really quite rapidly now. Really, can you feel it at all? Stretching yourself?
On Bear Island, that was one of the things he loved to do to guests on Bear Island, was to take them outdoors after dinner at night and have them look up at the night sky and look at the North Star. And he says if you really concentrate on the North Star, you can feel the rotation of the Earth. He said you feel it as a pressure on your left foot. And people would stand out there gazing up at the North Star, and now and then somebody would say, yes, they felt a pressure on their left foot. And he would be delighted.
As we're going around this way, away from it, pulling away. And I found that stretching myself, it seemed to be particularly trying to get my fingernail right on the horizon. Yeah, I really feel it quite strongly right now. A little tiny tip of that sun showing. But
that was his intriguing and enchanting quality about him, which is kind of contagious when anybody believes that deeply in anything,
So many people kind of, swimming along in their life, all of a sudden encounter Bucky. They didn't swim the same anymore.
If you could only have him in moderation. But that's the key to his genius. He could never be moderate.
Fuller was a preacher as much as a scientist, and a town crier as much as an architect. He was somebody who passionately believed in certain truths and proclaimed them with the zeal of a missionary.
he struggled against a sense of sometimes something as strong as despair, disorder, decay, the world not working. And the alternative was order and logic and the world working. And that's the side he was on. That was the side of the angels.
And he had a wonderful life. And deservedly so. There hasn't been anybody since that could lead us into the land of the future. We don't believe in the future. We don't believe in the land. We don't believe in anything anymore. He was the last of the great believers, wasn't he?
Nothing changes here. I really think that if my grandmother were to come back tomorrow, she'd recognize almost everything. Kerosene lamps as yet illuminate the houses at night. Water pitchers and basins are supplied from rainwater gathering cisterns. An abundant driftwood as yet provides fireplace-generated heat. There is still no telephone or other direct communication. Except for the old houses, stone walls, and stone-lined wellspring, Bear Island must look pretty much as it looks since the last ice age receded a few 100,000 years ago. Time and time again, the views of this bay are in my mind as I go round the world. You can understand how it was on an island, can't you?
Up until he was about 80, Bucky really denied the idea that he was going to die or could die. He didn't like to consider that possibility at all. And then after he was 80, I increasingly felt that he wanted to die. He was tired.
R. Buckminster Fuller, the philosopher and inventor who created the geodesic dome, has died at the age of 87. He was at the bedside of his wife of 66 years in Los Angeles when he suffered a heart attack. Hospital spokesman said that Mrs. Fuller was critically ill, but was not conscious at the time Fuller suffered the attack.
While he was holding her hand, he died. And still holding her hand, some hours later, she died.
Everybody thought when he died, so close to Anne, that he died first so he could be there to accept her. A lot of people have come up with that.
When he was alive, he said that he would live to be 120, and we all believed it.
R. Buckminster Fuller is buried on Spaceship Earth. Once a year, he makes a trip around the sun.
You've probably heard of the geodesic dome. I'd like to bring up here Buckminster Fuller.
Are you ready? There once was a square with a romantic flair. Pure bows on the Eden light. In the move that ensued, he went factory nude. Me Scropius, Corbu, and Wright. From home to a dome, where Georgian and Gothic once stood. Now chemical bonds alone got our blonde, and even the plumbing looks good. That architects sing of aesthetics that bring rich clients and poets to their knees. Just give me a home in a great circle dome where the stresses and strains are at ease. From home to a dome on the crest of a neighboring hill where the chores are all done before they're begun and eclectic nonsense is nil. Let modern folks dream of glass boxes with steam out along suburbia way. With levels, with loans, with breadwinner homes, no down money, lifetime to pay. Rome, all to a dome,
No banker was back with a dime. No mortgage to show, no payments to go. But you dreamed well, spend your own time.